Hi, folks. I want to acknowledge that I have the joy of giving 4 really dense slides to you. And so I'm going to ask you to put on your listening and thinking and watching caps, and acknowledge that there's a lot in here that I'm going to try to get through concisely. So I do have a script, and I don't like to read from a script, but I feel like I need to because there's some really tight, important things here. So I want to start with evaluation purpose. Now, there are 3 main buckets for conducting an evaluation. They are compliance and accountability, storytelling and communications, and learning and improvement. As we've said, in this series, we're focusing on learning and improvement. I want to just invite you to take a moment to read through the questions and needs associated with each purpose. Okay. I'm going to presume you've read it. And I want to add one super question to all of these buckets. And it's something like, are or how are we enacting or living up to our values? Which brings us to our next slide. So here I want to discuss how assumptions and values affect every part of the evaluation process, which in some cases can lead to bias. So I'm going to channel some wisdom from Libby the other day when you said that I was problematizing the idea of pure science with this slide. I'll say, yeah, and put a big explanation point there. So first, let's talk assumptions. I'm going to put aside how assumptions influence our programming decisions for the moment and hone in on the top half of the evaluation cycle. We all have assumptions about the nature of reality and assumptions of how we measure or understand reality. And these things drive the questions we ask, how we ask them, who we ask them with, and the methods we use to answer these questions. This is all number 1 on the simplified evaluation cycle. These things also drive how we make meaning of what we do with our findings, or number 2 in the eval cycle. And of course, they influence our programming decisions and organizational change making, number 3 on the eval cycle. We also need to consider our own assumptions and those of our stakeholders and how all of this can lead to bias. So here's some examples to make this clear. Let's make the assumption that all family members and community members are supportive of outdoor education, and that students are not participating for various random reasons like illness or scheduling conflicts. And we know this isn't the case, but stay with me. Now let's say we evaluate our program's outcomes in some way or another: student observation, work samples, group discussion, and we'd like to improve our program to better achieve the vision of equitable and positive outcomes for every Oregonian. However, we're of course only hearing from a select group of students that are at outdoor school, and therefore we'd have a significant amount of sampling bias. The students we need to hear from aren't actually being sampled. They're home. So if we took an equity-informed approach of evaluation, we might focus specifically on evaluating the reasons some students do not attend. But 2 quick points on assumptions first. So can you advance or animate the slide for me, Libby? Thank you. Okay. If we believe that outdoor school is a perfect and flawless program, and our evaluative purpose is solely to demonstrate this to stakeholders rather than to improve, we might only believe evidence that confirms this belief and ignore evidence to the contrary. This is confirmation bias. We might also make assumptions about method use, and there are a ton of assumptions around surveys. As an example, some folks see surveys as the primary way to evaluate, and others are fully against them. And I say it depends. Regardless, the point I'm trying to make is that these assumptions directly affect our evaluation. So finally, I'm going to go to the influence of values. So values also intersect and drive the evaluation process in similar ways to our assumptions. In the eval cycle above, we center equity as the primary value, which ideally directs all evaluative processes, which Christy just spoke about. So I'll share some examples using a different one of outdoor schools program values: relationships with our process. So we're relational in developing the outline, structure, and content for the series, which Christy also explained earlier. And I would situate in the top right part of the eval cycle, or number 2. Our main evaluation instruments were similarly developed. The outcomes evaluation that I lead biennially and the self-eval tools were all developed in community, and I expect will continue to be updated in a participatory manner. So I'd place this in the top left of the eval cycle, or number 1. Finally, in the bottom part of the eval cycle, number 3, is where all of you do your magic educating kids. And here, Outdoor School takes a supportive role by providing general funding and grant funds for the work you do. Okay, that's the densest slide, everyone. Thanks for sticking with me. So we'll spend a little more time on values, but I want to move to some technical aspects of eval now. So you can go to the next, Libby. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to unpack process and outcome evaluation. So first, I want to acknowledge that these frameworks are 2 of many and have their issues. Anyone familiar with logic models might be familiar with the terms you see here. I'll start with some simple definitions from the Rural Health Information Hub. Process evaluation assesses whether the program is being implemented as originally intended, what services are being delivered, who is receiving those services, and perceptions of the program among stakeholders. Outcome evaluation assesses the extent to which a program achieved its stated outcome goals and provides recommendations for future program improvements. So this is a metaphor I like and I've used before. Outcome evaluation considers what the listener hears and how it affected them, and process evaluation considers the radio tower and the signal it broadcasts. Folks often go to the what's in the ears, the outcomes, and I would encourage folks to go to the inputs as a starting point with evaluation. Some examples to flush this out. Actually, you can go back, Libby. So we evaluate inputs in many ways, including the analysis of outreach materials, curriculum, and budgets. Outdoor Schools program self-eval tools, the ERSET, CURSET, and CSET, provide a structure for process evaluation, and they use something similar to a rubric to gather data, facilitate critical reflection, and promote evidence-based decision-making. And this process can ultimately lead to program and organizational change. I'm just trying to talk you through the eval cycle here with these tools. And we can evaluate outcomes in many different ways, including the analysis of student work products, surveys, and exit interviews. And I'll advance to the next. Thanks, Libby. So I mentioned that there's some issues with the frameworks I just covered, and one of which is that they presume all of this happens in a vacuum. But in reality, there are measurable things that happen and affect our population of interest or community. Affects how our population of interest responds to our program. Okay, last big slide. Okay, next I want to move to method and data type. So I've listed 2 types of research design here, qualitative and quantitative. And these lists are not comprehensive, and you'll notice that they don't include mixed methods, which combine both approaches. I also want to point out that when thinking about qualitative and quantitative designs, our purpose, data type, approach, and analysis are all different. And it's important to be clear on these things when conducting an evaluation. So for example, if you're wanting to demonstrate compliance and accountability for student attendance and enrollment in your program, you might take a quantitative approach. You could ask, how many students attended from specific communities with specific identities? However, if you're wanting to learn and subsequently improve student attendance and enrollment in your program, you might take a qualitative approach and ask students and teachers and parents why some students attend while others do not. Lastly, I want to highlight a point around data. So you can work with existing data and new data to meet your purpose. You might hear the words primary for new and secondary for existing data, which aren't exactly the same, but they're close. And I want to point out something that I've witnessed over the years regarding data collecting, that there's a common misconception that we need to collect more data or new data in order to evaluate our work. This is not always the case. And there's often an abundance of rich data at hand, which can help you meet your evaluative purpose. So I want to encourage all of us to do our best to work with existing data when conducting an eval. Okay, I just went through those slides really fast to try to give us some time to move into some non-presentation format.
The idea behind this is for us to spend a little time taking a deeper look at those 4 big bucket concepts. And the prompt for consideration under each one of them is kind of like, what might happen? What issues, problems, unintended consequences might there be if we don't take a hard look at these concepts.
We're going to come back. I want to highlight one because this is something that I was going to speak on in a second when talking about culturally responsive evaluation. It's in evaluation purpose. And someone wrote, evaluation language and design that is not taking into account one's language capabilities. Yeah, it's really important that we think about folks' language capabilities in terms of the instrument we design, but also how the analysis is done, where the and the language that's in the findings that we have, and how all that is conveyed. And so it's really important to attend to folks' language, their voice. So thanks, it's really insightful. Yeah, someone spoke about if we don't align things with our purpose, it can be a misuse of time. And sadly, I feel like a lot of people have said, I have all this data, I have all these data, sorry. And we just keep moving on and collecting more and more, but why, right? If we're not using that and it's not aligning with our purpose. And so usually when I meet with a potential new client, I try to just get at what they're hoping to accomplish as a starting point. And we're going to move you all towards that, this why of evaluation in a minute. I like that someone wrote toxic positivity. I was struggling with actually toxic criticism in my one thing I was talking about. So I love that you could have both. You could have someone who's like, oh, we're just great, we're doing so good, which I think happens in the cult of outdoor school. And then the other side is the evaluator could be like, well, we could do better with this, we could do better with this. And so finding that balance between an asset-based approach and being realistic about it and making sure that we are challenging our assumptions and recognizing we all have work to do. So I think if you're familiar with grant reporting, the old model would be just to say all the things we're doing great, but it's really important to really think about, no, what are the things we could do to get better? And so I think be astute to include that and even to lead with that sometimes. Some traditional evaluation wisdom is to start with process eval before doing outcomes eval. And I think there's a hiccup that we all just jump straight to surveys or outcome eval. And it's like, well, let's make sure we're doing what we said we're going to do. Yeah. Still valid, yeah. And I report on outputs as well, and I put that in the outcomes bucket. It's usually outputs, outcomes, and the distinction there within outcomes and impacts is usually time or legitimate change to the community. Yeah, these things which are lasting. All helpful distinctions, but they're still just a model for breaking down and understanding what we're doing. I want to read one that's jumping out to me. It says, we might have a whole lot of numbers that are hard to extrapolate into meaningful action. And I think that's one of the catches by jumping straight to outcomes, is that, remember that theoretical jump between the radio tower that puts up the signal to what people hear. There's just so much stuff that can happen in between. And so by focusing on the processes, the things we do, the way we engage our community, our organizational identity, all these things which we have kind of indicated in the self-eval tools, that's all of it, but that can really help us make sure that we're actually meeting our goals.